We've heard a lot about climate risk disclosure going back years, but we've certainly heard much more about it even this year, especially with all the revelations around what Exxon knew and when did it know it about climate change. And that's led to a variety of investigations into whether Exxon was hiding the ball and what did it disclose and what didn't it disclose. Should it be held liable for that lack of disclosure? It's turned into a big issue, and the SEC is looking again at trying to clarify the pretty ambiguous risk disclosure guidance that it has provided in the past. We have task forces right now looking at the issue. So it's an important issue. It's also a very complicated issue to really figure out what's being talked about, what would make a difference, and what probably wouldn't make a difference. So we thought it made sense to include it as a trending story here in the Climate Web and to point you to some useful information and ideas. Let me go ahead and jump in to help structure our conversation here. So the key points that I'll cover is that, yes, risk disclosure does sound simple. If companies have risk, they ought to be disclosing it. And hence, that's sort of the basis for could Exxon be in disclosure trouble? If Exxon knew that it faced a lot of climate risk years and years and years ago, should it have told the public that, regulators that, investors? Should it have told investors that it faced significant climate risk even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago when it was researching climate change, and some of its scientists certainly knew a lot about climate change? Here's the problem. A large part of the idea of climate risk in terms of what it is we would disclose about climate risk, a very large part of that climate risk is due to the potential for policy action to restrict fossil fuel use. Now, here we are in 2016, many fossil fuels, with the possible exception of coal, certainly not at the scale once anticipated, but with the case of oil in the transport sector and gas in the electricity sector, that we'll be using these fossil fuels for decades into the future. So what would it have meant for Exxon to disclose climate risk back in the 1980s? That maybe someday there will be climate policy? Well, that becomes very subjective. And I would argue that based on what we now know about risk disclosure and just how subjective it is, it depends entirely on what assumptions you make about not only climate change, but much more importantly, climate change policy. And who knows what's going to happen on climate change policy from one year to the next. So how could you ever really end up holding somebody culpable for not having anticipated or appeared yet? So that's the real trickiness here of trying to make climate risk disclosure culpable. And I think it makes much more serious risk assessments and climate risk scenario work to figure out just how much they do have at risk if certain things did happen, if certain types of climate policy came into place, for example. That's not to say that they will come into place, changes in investment behavior. So I also would argue, and we've written about this, that what would be really useful is not so much disclosing quote unquote climate risk, because that is so subjective and you really never know what's behind the conclusion that yes, we face climate risk, or no, we don't face climate risk. And that's really what you would want to know as an investor. So one thing that it would be very useful for companies to disclose is the scenario they used when looking at climate risk, because knowing what that scenario is would tell you a lot about how to interpret any conclusions that they came to vis-a-vis climate risk. And it would also give you a pretty good sense of how seriously the company was even taking climate change as a potential risk issue. If the climate scenario really doesn't have any aggressive policy scenarios or public opinion change scenarios or anything like that, then it's pretty easy to see that climate risk will not be material to that company. But if we knew what scenarios companies were using, that actually would give investors much more information than they have today. So to dig deeper into the climate web on this, we've pulled together just a few resources here, some of the stories introducing some of the topics that I've been mentioning here. This task force report came out recently. Phase 1, Phase 2 will be coming out. We've proposed to them the use of scenario disclosure. And if you want to dig much sources, hundreds of news stories and much more. But you can also get a lot from this trending story